Cassidy Flynn stood at the platform, clutching a letter with Ingrid's picture, watching the dusty stagecoach approach through the heat. He'd memorized every detail of her face during those long winter nights. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the gentle smile of a German woman seeking a new life. But when the coach door opened, the woman who stepped out had dark hair pulled back severely, almond-shaped eyes that scanned the horizon with careful precision, and clothes that looked nothing like what any bride would wear for meeting her husband. She carried a small wooden box pressed against her chest like it contained something precious or dangerous. The stagecoach driver handed down her single bag and muttered something about wrong papers before climbing back up. The woman stood perfectly still, her gaze moving from face to face among the few people gathered at the station, searching for something or someone. Cassidy looked at the letter again, then at the woman. This wasn't Ingrid Schmidt. This wasn't even close. But she was looking directly at him now, her expression unreadable, and she held up a piece of paper with writing he couldn't understand. The strange thing was, she seemed to be expecting him too, as if she belonged here, as if this whole impossible situation made perfect sense to her. But how could that be when everything about this moment was wrong? The woman stepped closer, her worn boots clicking against the wooden platform. She held the paper higher, pointing at something written in characters that looked like tiny drawings. Her lips moved, forming words in a language Cassidy had never heard before, each syllable precise and urgent. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake," Cassidy said, his voice rougher than intended. He'd practiced what he would say to Ingrid 100 times, but none of those rehearsed words seemed to fit this moment. The woman's expression shifted, confusion creeping across her features. She looked at the letter in his hand, then back at her own paper. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Greta, then pointed to him with a questioning tilt of her head. Cassidy shook his head slowly. "I'm Cassidy Flynn. I was expecting someone else." He held up Ingrid's picture, watching as the woman studied it with growing understanding in her dark eyes. She examined the photograph for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a different picture entirely, a man with a thick beard and kind eyes, someone Cassidy had never seen before. She showed him the photograph, then pointed to herself again, saying those same foreign words with more emphasis. The pieces began forming a terrible picture in Cassidy's mind. Two people, two letters, two completely different arrangements that had somehow gotten tangled together in ways that made no sense. But how did such a massive error even happen? The woman seemed to reach the same conclusion. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she looked around the small station platform as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The isolation, the emptiness, the vast expanse of unfamiliar territory stretching in every direction. She spoke again, this time with a note of concern that needed no translation. Her hands gestured toward the departing stagecoach, which was already disappearing into the distance, leaving behind only a cloud of settling dust. Samuel Crow emerged from the general store, his weathered face creasing into a frown as he approached them. "Problem, Cassidy? This ain't the German girl you've been expecting for months." "No, it's not." Cassidy felt heat rising in his chest, a mixture of disappointment and frustration that had nowhere to go. "Seems like somebody mixed up the arrangements pretty badly." Samuel studied the woman with obvious discomfort. "Well, she can't stay here. Next stage won't come through for 2 weeks." The woman understood enough of their tone to sense the problem. She clutched her wooden box tighter and took a step backward as if preparing to run. But there was nowhere to run to in this endless, unforgiving landscape. That's when Cassidy noticed something else troubling. The woman's dress was torn at the sleeve, and there was a dark stain on her bag that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The blood stain made everything different. Cassidy found himself stepping closer instead of backing away, his frustration replaced by something sharper and more immediate. The woman noticed his attention on her bag and instinctively shifted it behind her back, but not before he caught sight of more damage. "Ma'am," he said carefully, pointing to her torn sleeve. "Are you hurt?" She followed his gaze and touched the fabric gingerly, then shook her head with what seemed like practiced denial, but her movements were too careful, too controlled, like someone trying not to aggravate an injury. Samuel's expression darkened as he picked up on the same details. "Cassidy, maybe we should get Doc Miller to take a look at her." The woman's eyes went wide with alarm at the suggestion. She shook her head vigorously and backed toward the edge of the platform, clutching that wooden box against her chest like a shield. Whatever was inside it, she seemed more afraid of losing it than of bleeding. "Easy now," Cassidy said, raising his hands in a gesture he hoped looked peaceful. "Nobody's going to force anything on you." But the damage was already done. The woman's breathing had quickened, and she kept glancing toward the empty road, as if calculating her chances of surviving alone in the wilderness. Her desperation was becoming more obvious by the minute. Samuel lowered his voice. "Something ain't right about this whole situation. How does a German woman end up with arrangements for another German bride? And where's your Ingrid?" That was the question Cassidy had been avoiding. If this woman was here instead of Ingrid, what had happened to the woman he'd been corresponding with for 8 months? The woman whose letters had gotten him through the loneliest winter of his life. The woman seemed to understand they were talking about her. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with string. The writing on the outside was in English, but the address was wrong. Not Cassidy's ranch, but somewhere called Riverside Settlement, nearly 100 miles north. She pointed to the letters, then to herself, then in the direction the stagecoach had gone. Her meaning was becoming clear, even without words. She was supposed to be somewhere else entirely, meeting someone else entirely. "Riverside," Samuel muttered. "That's where old Wilhelm Weber lives. Been trying to get himself a wife for near on 5 years. The woman nodded eagerly at the name Wilhelm, recognizing it immediately. But recognition brought a new kind of worry to her face. She looked at the position of the sun, then at the empty road, and said something in her own language that sounded like a prayer. Whatever had happened during her journey, whatever had caused that blood on her belongings, she was running out of time to fix it. And now Cassidy realized he might be the only person standing between her and a very dangerous mistake. Cassidy made his decision before his mind could talk him out of it. "Samuel, ready my wagon. I'm taking her to Riverside." The older man's eyebrows shot up. "That's a hard day's ride through rough country, and you don't even know if Wilhelm's still expecting a bride." But Cassidy was already moving toward his supplies. The woman watched him with sharp intelligence, following his preparations, even though she couldn't understand the words. When he gestured toward his wagon, she nodded quickly and gathered her belongings. As she lifted her bag, she winced and pressed her free hand against her ribs. The movement pulled her dress tight against her side, revealing a dark patch that had spread since they'd been talking. Whatever injury she was hiding was getting worse. "Ma'am," Cassidy said firmly, stepping closer. "You're bleeding." She started to shake her head again, but this time her knees buckled slightly. Cassidy caught her elbow, feeling how she trembled with the effort of staying upright. The wooden box slipped from her grip, and for a moment he thought it would crash to the platform. Instead, she caught it with reflexes that seemed almost desperate. The box rattled when she grabbed it, like it contained loose coins or metal pieces, something valuable enough to risk her life protecting. "Look," Cassidy said, his voice gentler now. "I don't know what happened to you on that stagecoach, and I don't need to know. But you're hurt. You're in the wrong place, and it's going to be dark soon. You can trust me to get you where you need to go, or you can try your luck alone out there." The woman studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she could recognize. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. Samuel appeared with medical supplies from his store. "At least let me bind that up before you go. Can't have you bleeding to death on the trail." This time the woman didn't resist when Samuel approached with clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey. She set the wooden box down carefully beside her feet, never taking her eyes off it, and lifted her arm to expose the wound. The gash ran along her ribs, clean and straight like it had come from a blade rather than an accident. Samuel's hand stilled when he saw it, and he exchanged a meaningful look with Cassidy over the woman's head. This wasn't the result of a rough stagecoach ride. Someone had tried to hurt her deliberately, and given how carefully she guarded that box, Cassidy was starting to suspect he knew why. The woman endured Samuel's ministrations without making a sound, but her attention kept drifting to the horizon. She was listening for something, or watching for someone, and her growing anxiety was becoming impossible to ignore. When Samuel finished bandaging the wound, the woman immediately reached for her wooden box, but as her fingers closed around it, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the empty landscape. The woman went rigid, her face draining of color as she recognized something about those approaching riders that Cassidy couldn't yet identify. The woman grabbed Cassidy's arm with surprising strength, her fingernails digging through his shirt sleeve. She spoke rapidly in her own language, pointing toward the approaching dust cloud, and the fear in her voice needed no translation.
3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer, their horses lathered with sweat like they'd been traveling hard and fast. The lead rider was a thick-set man with a sheriff's badge glinting on his vest, but something about his posture seemed wrong to Cassidy, too eager, too focused on their small group at the station. "That's Sheriff Brennan from Silver Creek," Samuel muttered. "What's he doing this far from his territory?" The woman had gone completely still beside Cassidy, but her grip on his arm tightened when she heard the name. Somehow she knew exactly who was coming for her. Sheriff Brennan dismounted while his 2 deputies flanked the platform. His smile was too wide as he approached, the kind of expression that didn't reach a man's eyes. "Afternoon, folks. We're looking for a German woman who might have come through on today's stage, traveling alone, probably carrying stolen property."
The woman's breathing became shallow and quick. She shifted closer to Cassidy, using his body to partially shield herself from view, but there was nowhere to hide on the open platform. "What kind of stolen property?" Cassidy asked, keeping his voice level despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Gold coins from a robbery over in Millerville, about $3,000 worth taken from the bank 2 days ago." Brennan's gaze moved past Cassidy to focus on the woman. The banker's description matches this lady exactly. But something was wrong with the story. If she'd robbed a bank 2 days ago in Millerville, how had she ended up on a stagecoach bound for Riverside with letters addressed to Wilhelm Weber? The timeline didn't make sense. The woman seemed to understand enough of what was being said to know she was being accused. She shook her head vigorously and held up the bundle of letters, trying to show them her legitimate reason for being there. Brennan barely glanced at the correspondence. "Those could be forged easy enough. What I'm interested in is what's in that box she's been guarding so careful." The woman clutched the wooden container against her chest and took a step backward. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked directly at Cassidy with something like trust in her dark eyes. She said a single word in English, heavily accented but unmistakable: "Please." Cassidy found himself stepping between her and the sheriff without conscious thought. "You got a warrant for searching her belongings, Sheriff? Don't need one for stolen property in plain sight." Brennan's hand drifted toward his gun. "Step aside, Flynn. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern him now, in ways he couldn't fully understand. Something about Brennan's story felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it during the hard ride from Silver Creek, and the woman's obvious terror seemed less about being caught and more about being found. The sheriff's deputies spread out slightly, their hands resting on their weapons. Whatever was about to happen, they'd clearly done this before. That's when Cassidy noticed the fresh scratches on Brennan's knuckles and the small tear in his vest that looked suspiciously like it had come from fingernails. The scratches on Brennan's hands told a story that contradicted everything he just said. Fresh wounds from fingernails, the kind a person got when someone fought back desperately. Cassidy's gaze moved to the woman's hands, noting the broken nails and scraped knuckles that matched perfectly. "Funny thing about bank robberies," Cassidy said, his voice carrying farther than intended. "Usually there's witnesses, descriptions, maybe even a wanted poster, but I haven't seen any notices about a German woman robbing banks." Brennan's jaw tightened. "Information travels slow out here. The notices probably haven't reached this far yet. Or maybe there never was a robbery." Cassidy kept his hand near his gun, watching as the 2 deputies positioned themselves for a crossfire. "Maybe you just want what's in that box, and you figure nobody's going to question a sheriff's word against a foreign woman who can't speak English."
The woman seemed to understand the tension, even without following the words. She pressed the wooden box tighter against her chest and whispered something that sounded like a prayer in her native language. Samuel had gone quiet behind the counter of his store, but Cassidy caught the soft click of a rifle being readied. The old shopkeeper might not understand everything happening, but he recognized corruption when he saw it. "Last warning, Flynn," Brennan said, his hand now openly resting on his gun butt. "Hand over the woman and whatever she's carrying, or this gets complicated for everyone." It's already complicated. Cassidy shifted his weight, preparing for what seemed inevitable. "Because I'm thinking you're the one who gave her that knife wound. I'm thinking you tried to take whatever she's got, and she fought back harder than you expected." The woman's eyes widened as she followed enough of the conversation to understand that Cassidy was defending her. She looked between him and the sheriff, then did something unexpected. She opened the wooden box just enough for Cassidy to see inside. Gold coins gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, but not loose like stolen money would be. These were arranged in neat rows, wrapped in silk cloth with German characters written on small paper tags: Family savings, not bank loot. Money saved over years. Probably everything she owned in the world. Her dowry, Cassidy said, understanding flooding through him. That's not stolen money. That's her marriage portion for Wilhelm Weber. Brennan's expression shifted from confident to desperate. He'd revealed too much, shown his hand too clearly. Now his only options were to take what he wanted by force or retreat empty-handed. The sheriff made his choice by drawing his gun. But before anyone could react, the woman did something that surprised everyone. She hurled the wooden box toward Samuel's store and threw herself sideways off the platform, rolling behind Cassidy's wagon. The gold coins scattered across the wooden boards like fallen stars, glinting in the dust. In the chaos of diving for cover and reaching for weapons, nobody noticed the second stagecoach approaching from the opposite direction. Gunshots cracked across the platform as Cassidy dove behind the water trough. Splinters exploded from the wooden boards where he'd been standing moments before. The woman had made herself small behind his wagon wheel, her dark eyes tracking the movements of Brennan's deputies as they sought better positions. Samuel's rifle barked from inside his store, forcing one deputy to scramble for cover behind a hitching post. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to retreat across the open ground surrounding the station. The approaching stagecoach hadn't slowed despite the gunfire. Instead, it was coming faster, the driver whipping his horses into a full gallop directly toward the platform. Dust billowed behind the racing vehicle as it closed the distance. "Give it up, Flynn," Brennan shouted from behind a wooden crate. "All this for some foreign woman and her gold." But it wasn't about the gold anymore, and they both knew it. It was about a corrupt sheriff who thought he could prey on travelers far from help, and about a woman whose only crime was being in the wrong place with something valuable. The woman caught Cassidy's attention and pointed toward the scattered coins glinting in the dust. She shook her head firmly and made a throwing gesture, indicating he should forget about the money. Her message was clear. The gold wasn't worth their lives. The racing stagecoach was close enough now that Cassidy could see the driver's face. A young man with determined features whipping the horses harder than any sane person would on such rough ground. Behind him, rifle barrels poked through the coach windows. Brennan saw them too. His confidence wavered as he realized the odds were about to shift dramatically against him. "Mount up," he yelled to his deputies. "We're leaving." But the woman had other plans. While everyone's attention was focused on the approaching coach, she darted out from behind the wagon and began gathering her scattered coins with remarkable speed. Her movements were precise and economical, like someone who'd had to pack quickly under dangerous circumstances before. "Stay down," Cassidy called to her, but she continued collecting her savings with single-minded determination. A bullet whined past her shoulder, close enough to tear her already damaged dress. The stagecoach thundered onto the platform with a crash that shook the entire structure. Armed men poured out before it had fully stopped, their weapons trained on Brennan and his deputies. These weren't lawmen or drifters. They were German men in dark clothing, moving with military precision. The woman looked up from gathering her coins and spoke rapidly to the newcomers in her native language. The lead man responded with obvious relief, then turned cold eyes toward Sheriff Brennan. "You have caused much trouble for my sister," he said in accented but clear English. "She was supposed to arrive safely at Riverside. Instead, you attack her and steal from her." Brennan's face went pale as he realized the woman hadn't been traveling alone after all. She'd had protection following at a distance, and now they'd caught up. The sheriff and his men were surrounded, outgunned, and facing people who had every reason to want justice for what had been done. But as Cassidy watched the tense standoff develop, he realized something that chilled him. These weren't just protective relatives. They were armed professionals, and they hadn't come all this way just to rescue one woman's dowry. The lead man stepped forward, his rifle never wavering from Brennan's chest. "My name is Klaus Muller. This woman is Greta, my sister. She carries important papers, not just marriage arrangements." Cassidy felt the pieces clicking together in ways that made the whole situation more complex. Greta wasn't just a bride who'd gotten lost. She was someone important enough to warrant armed escorts and careful planning. "What kind of papers?" Samuel called from his store, keeping his rifle trained on the remaining deputy. Klaus's expression hardened. "Documents that prove German workers built more of the railroad than any company wants to admit. Papers that show how much money was never paid, how many men died working for promises that were broken." Greta spoke rapidly to her brother in German, gesturing toward Cassidy. Klaus's stern features softened slightly as he listened to whatever she was telling him. "My sister says you protected her when you had no reason to help a stranger," Klaus said to Cassidy. "She says you were willing to risk your life for her dowry, even though you thought she was the wrong woman." "She is the wrong woman," Cassidy replied, still crouched behind the water trough. "But that doesn't mean she deserved what this corrupt sheriff tried to do to her." Brennan had been listening to the exchange with growing desperation. Now he made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "You're all making a mistake. I'm a sworn lawman, and these people are criminals carrying stolen goods." "Then you won't mind if we take you back to Silver Creek and let your own townspeople decide," Klaus said calmly. "We can show them the knife you used on my sister, compare it to her wound. We can let them examine these papers you claim are stolen." The color drained completely from Brennan's face. Going back to face questions with evidence against him was the last thing he wanted. His hand tightened on his gun, but he was surrounded by men who clearly knew how to use their weapons. Greta finished gathering her scattered coins and carefully placed them back in the wooden box. She approached Cassidy slowly, her movements careful due to her injury, and held out her hand to help him up from behind the trough. "Thank you," she said in heavily accented English, the words obviously difficult for her, but sincere. Standing this close, Cassidy could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength that had carried her through whatever danger she'd faced on her journey. She wasn't the German bride he'd been expecting, but she was remarkable in ways he was only beginning to understand. "What happens now?" he asked Klaus. "Does she still go to Riverside to marry Wilhelm Weber?" Greta and her brother exchanged a long look filled with unspoken communication. When Klaus finally answered, his response changed everything Cassidy thought he knew about the situation. "There is no Wilhelm Weber," Klaus said quietly. "That was a name we invented, an address we created to give my sister a reason to travel this route safely." Cassidy stared at him. "Then why is she here?" "To meet with railroad supervisors in Denver. She speaks 5 languages and keeps records better than any man they've hired. The marriage arrangement was protection, a way to travel without suspicion." Klaus glanced at his sister with obvious pride. "She's here to make sure German workers get the wages they were promised." Greta nodded and spoke in careful English. "I have numbers, names, truth about who built railroad." The deception was brilliant in its simplicity. A German woman traveling alone would face constant danger and suspicion, but a bride going to meet her intended husband would be left alone, considered harmless. Brennan made his move during the revelation, lunging for his horse while everyone's attention was focused on the conversation, but Samuel's rifle cracked from the store window, and the sheriff crashed to the ground with a bullet through his leg. "That's for trying to rob a woman under my roof," Samuel called out. Klaus's men quickly subdued the remaining deputies. They would all be taken back to face justice, but Brennan's career as a corrupt lawman was finished. "What happens now?" Cassidy asked Greta directly.
She looked at him for a long moment, then spoke to her brother in German. Klaus translated with something that might have been amusement in his voice. "She says the original plan was to continue to Denver after the meeting at Riverside, but plans can change when you find something unexpected." Greta stepped closer to Cassidy, close enough that he could smell the scent of lavender in her dark hair, despite everything they'd been through. "You help me when you think I am wrong person," she said slowly. "That tells me who you are inside." "And what did it tell you?" "That maybe I find right person in wrong place." Cassidy felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with letters or arrangements or expectations. This woman had faced danger with courage, protected what mattered to her, and shown more strength in one afternoon than some people displayed in a lifetime. "Would you consider staying?" he asked. "At least long enough to let that wound heal properly." Greta's smile was small but genuine. "I think maybe I stay longer than that." Klaus gathered his men and prepared to escort Brennan and his deputies to justice. Before leaving, he approached Cassidy with Greta's wooden box. "Keep this safe for her," he said. "She has chosen to trust you with something more valuable than gold." As the dust settled and the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Cassidy realized that sometimes getting the wrong thing delivered to your door turned out to be exactly what you needed. The loneliness that had driven him to seek a mail-order bride had vanished completely. In its place was something real, unexpected, and infinitely more valuable than any arrangement could have provided.